Hi, my name is Catherine Sedota. I want to welcome you to the Core Competency Workshop Series. This is the 1st of September 2025 in the 2025 fall semester. And we're starting with good clinical practice with a really excellent presentation. I've seen this one, and he does a really great job, and it's Dr. Sanjay Sethi. We have a lot of workshops. This is the first of this series, but a lot of them are in video format. So what I can do is put the link to the Core Competency Workshop series and the videos in the chat. And please feel free to check out our videos from a lot of different series. This one just happens to be good clinical practice, but we also have series in responsible conduct of research. We have some bird community engagement. So we actually have quite a lot of series. So that is something you can check out. I do want to tell you that if you do attend all 4 of these workshops in the series, you'll be eligible to receive a certificate of completion in good clinical practice. If you cannot attend 1 to 2 workshops, please email me because I can find an alternate option for you in order to make up that work. It just involves a small protocol because we do have these in video format. So please just email me, cmp9@buffalo.edu. You can always make some of this up. And the certificate of completion will come about a week or 2 after the last workshop in the series. So we have time to get things signed and sent out to you. Also, continuing medical education CME credits are available for those who do require it, and you can receive up to 6 for this. If you are a physician, that is something you answer within the registration, and anyone who does attend all sessions that is a physician, I do send that off to the CME office so that you can receive those credits if you wish to. And finally, we also have a micro-credential in good clinical practice. Now, in order to receive the micro-credential, which is much different than the certificate of completion, there's some work that you have to do with it. Now, I do have the videos available also in video format. I have these presentations available in video format, so you can always go back and look up information. And some of the assignments include, for this one, basically selecting 2 GCP principles relevant to your area of research, and you're going to explain why they are related. There's a short overview of how you would prepare for a research audit. There's a couple case studies and a short reflection. So if you are interested in the micro-credential, again, please email me and I'll put that in the chat. And finally, there's going to be a survey that I send to you. I'm going to put it in the chat approximately at 5 p.m. And I'm also going to send it to you tomorrow. And I'll send it to you again next week, just because of the fact that the evaluations improve our workshop series, and we also needed to report to our funding sources. So that's all we have. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. And I also want to stop sharing this, and I want to start sharing something very small because I at least want you to realize what the objectives are for this workshop. So I'm going to share that. And we're going to look at these again at the end. And this is only because of the fact that this is something that we actually evaluate you on. The presenters pick the learning objectives, and we just want to make sure that they're covered. And if you have any questions regarding them at the end, Dr. Sethi, I'm sure, would be happy to answer them. So for learning objective 1, he's going to develop an understanding of the various terms, acronyms applicable to good clinical practice. And he has a spectacular title for this one, ICH, GCP, CFR, ISO, making sense of the soup of acronyms. So we'll be covering those. And the second one is to develop an understanding of the essential components of good clinical practice and research. So that's what he's going to be covering, and I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to pass it over to our wonderful speaker. And I want to thank Liz for putting the workshop series schedule in the chat, which she's already done. Dr. Sethi, on to you.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And welcome, everyone. Let's see if the share works. There we are. Okay. So, welcome, everyone. And I'm director of the Clinical Research Office and associate director for the CTSI. This is, I'm sure you must have done City and done GCP, but this is a bit fair amount of what I'm going to talk about is GCP, a good clinical practice related. But there are all these other terms that, we love to talk in acronyms and jargon, as I call it. And hopefully by the end of it, this all makes sense to you. And also then, so that's going to be first part of it, kind of explaining these terms, the meanings, the implications, what constitutes good clinical practice. And then the second part, I'm going to be basically focusing on how do we, from mainly from the investigator or research team point of view. So I'm looking at you as researchers, investigators, part of the research team, coordinators, whatever. The idea is that how do you kind of stay within the confines, follow the GCP? There are different perspectives. I'm not going to talk from the sponsor's perspective so much. I'm not going to, though you could be a sponsor if you have your own investigator-initiated clinical trial, and also from the other things that play in like IRBs, etc. So I won't be discussing those components, but mainly because it's such a big topic. So let's get into it. So we already saw the objectives, so we don't have to go over those. So let's start with GCP. What is GCP? And good GCP stands for Good Clinical Practice. So basically, it's a set of guidelines. It's an internationally recognized set of guidelines. And we'll go through a bit of the history as to how they came about. And essentially, they cover the entire aspect of designing, conducting, monitoring, analyzing, reporting, the whole clinical trial. So they really are focused on clinical trials. And what makes them important is because they're international and they're widely accepted all over there was an attempt to harmonize these rules internationally because many of these clinical trials actually happen in a global setting now. Um, of course, before we will also want to make sure we're on the same page as to what is a clinical trial. Basically, a clinical trial is designed to assess the safety and efficacy of new drugs, devices, and other medical treatments in human subjects. So the GCPs apply to clinical trials and are a set of guidelines. So I have some interactive questions, and I don't have a formal polling process, but just speak up. So in the conduct of a clinical trial, who does not need to follow GCP? Anyone?
You want to answer, you can type it in the chat, or please feel free to unmute and go ahead and answer. It's just what you think that's important. The vendor, I have one answer.
Okay. Yeah, actually, in a way, the participant is the least, participant has the least role. I mean, they don't know what GCP is. So the participant, in a way, has the least role to follow the rules or the guidelines. I mean, they of course have to be contributory to the clinical trials, but all the rest, as you will see, the sponsor, the research team, investigators, all the people who work with the investigators, and more, and actually the vendors are a big part of it now because so many of the clinical trials have become so complicated and use so many other companies and vendors, they also actually have to follow the rules now. Okay, so why do we need GCP? There are two purposes that GCP or good clinical practice is trying to do. One is they want to protect human research subjects. So they want to make sure the participants in human research are protected, their rights are protected. So that's one aspect of it. But they also want to make sure that the trials that are done are useful. For these clinical trials, there are frankly, there's a lot of clinical trials which have data which is not difficult to interpret because of design issues or size issues, etc. So they want to make sure that the data obtained is useful and has integrity. So that's the reason why GCP exists. So for these dual purposes. All right. So let me ask you another question. So again, this is I'd rather have you jump in and just speak into the mic. Uh, so is good clinical practice an appropriate name for this? It's more of a thinking exercise. And I'll be glad to tell you my response, but I'd like to hear anyone else. You would think, is this an appropriate name I don't know how the genesis came about of the name, but you think, is it appropriate?
Right. It doesn't really say anything about research in here, and I think we can hope to do better than good.
Yeah, exactly. I like those, Bill. I like both those points. Yeah, I agree. Anyone else with any opinions about this? Okay, well, Bill, I totally agree. When my first response, when I first came across GCP, I said, how does this pertain to research? So even something like good clinical trials or excellent clinical trials, something else could be much more appropriate. I don't know how it came about, but it is what it is. Okay, so that's and we could rename it. So let's talk about how the GCP came about. We had a lot of issues with clinical trials and human subjects, participant research, and so the first thing that came along this, I'm sure most of you know, was the Nuremberg Code, which basically was mainly directed towards the consent and safety of the participants. And then that got more formalized and grew bigger with the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964. Then there was a WHO guidelines that came about in 1982. The problem was we had all these guidelines, but they were all at a national level, and so there were all these countries came up with different standards for clinical trials and human subjects research protection. So then what happened was there was this conference, and they call it the International, that's where ICH comes from. So that stands for International Conference for Harmonization. And you can read the rest of the name, for technical requirements of registration of pharmaceuticals in human use. So the ICH got together as a group from all over the world, and they came up first with this GCP to kind of harmonize things across globally. So they were first approved in 1996, implemented in 1997. 2016, the revision 2 came along. They actually added more issues of encouraging implementation of more efficient approaches to GCP. Also brought in electronic records because those were, of course, have become very prevalent. And then now we have a brand new edition, R3, which has been accepted and is getting implemented in 2025. And in this, there are certain different principles they have brought in. One of them is, quality by design. They say when you design clinical trials, build in quality there. It's kind of now the fundamental driving factor in this revision is one size does not fit all. So if you look at the R2 version, they were pretty much saying do this, this, and this, not giving any flexibility, very kind of prescriptive without realizing that things and the world is changing. So now they advocate that bring quality by design into the studies, utilize proportionate risk-based approaches. I'll talk a bit more about that, and do it critically. So it's actually quite a nice change in this. So why did they do this revision? So the concerns with the R2 was that the clinical trial ecosystem is rapidly evolving. Electronic records, remote studies, all sorts of innovative designs. There was also this lack of proportionality that you may have a study which is using a minimal risk intervention, and you have the same rules apply to it with a study which involves something that could potentially kill people. So there was no proportionality to the way we implemented these guidelines, and that's the one size fit all. And then also we realized during COVID, a lot of the trials at that time were done fast, rapid. We were not too worried about GCP. We got things done. So that also taught us lessons. And also conversely, they realized that studies that were not really clinical trials, were not for development of pharmaceuticals. A lot of places were kind of saying use GCP there also. A lot of the agencies, so they wanted to kind of make it more focused where it applies, and also make it more flexible. So that's what's happening in the new revisions. So they've actually they've now recognized that there are different ways to do trials, that not simply the standard randomized control plus placebo controlled trial. They can be real world evidence. They've also recognized technology. A lot of digital health technology is now used in trials. And they've really said that, let's make it more practical, more feasible. And I mentioned about proportionality and risk-based approaches. And thoughtfulness in the design and conduct of trials. Now, all of this may not apply so much to us, but our sponsors should be thinking about this. And I'm hoping this becomes more and more incorporated into the clinical trials that come our way as we do them, or if we are designing clinical trials, we now do have the ability to incorporate all the elements and still stay within the good clinical practice guidelines. So there's a lot of, I should say, these are much more forward-looking than in the past. All right, so we got into GCP and ICH, but unfortunately, when we are doing clinical trials, GCP and ICH are not the only rules that apply. There are all these other rules that come into play, ethical issues, FDA regulations, our own universities' guidelines. So let me define a couple more really important rules as they apply to clinical trials. So one of them is the common rules, or the CFR, sorry. So the CFR is, what is CFR? There's another acronym you hear a lot. It's the Code of Federal Regulations. So essentially all the federal rules are codified and published in this Code of Federal Regulations. So that's what CFR stands for. So again, you don't need to remember these numbers, but you may hear these terms. 21 CFR 50 governs the rules for informed consent, CFR 56 for IRB, CFR 312 for the whole IND, investigational new drug application, and you can see the subparts over there. 1572 is a statement by the investigator. So these are all from CFR or from the Code of Federal Regulations. For devices, CFR 812 covers investigational device exemptions with all the different subparts. Interestingly, there's no Form 1572 for device studies. They have a statement of the investigator. Another CFR that you need to be aware of is 21 CFR Part 11. So, the title 21. So 21 refers to the title number. So all the codes are divided into 50 titles. Titles 21 concerns the FDA, and Part 11 is actually specifically interested in electronic records and electronic signatures. So this 21 CFR Part 11 is becoming very relevant as we move into the non-paper age, more and more of electronic trials and electronic ways of conducting studies. So this subpart or this section is becoming more and more relevant.
We have
Okay.
a question. May I ask it?
Oh, absolutely.
The question is it the case that some sponsors may live in R2 world but haven't adapted R3 yet?
Yeah, that is true. Right now they're supposed to adopt R3, but it's a transition process. I had to work on my slides last night and today morning to get the R3 into it. So clearly it's a process of transition at this point, but clearly the current guidelines are R3. We can discuss that a bit more. That's a great question because, I think they need to break out of the mindset of R2. They're so used to doing things a certain way, but you can see that the R3 is actually giving them much more flexibility. So I think, yes, that is true. But the things will change. They have to comply with, the R3. It's not, it's not optional for them. They have to move into the R3 world. Okay, so what is ISO? That's another term we hear sometimes. And the ISO is International Organization for Standardization. And the one we need to concern about is ISO 14155, because this provides the good clinical practice for device investigations. And so it's kind of the equivalent of GCP is for pharmaceuticals. For devices is ISO 14155. Currently, the version we use is from 2020, but a new revision is coming. And so I think that'll be coming out and that'll change matters there. All right, I was going to pause here for any questions, but if there are any other questions, just put them in the chat. And
There are none in the chat at this time.
okay, great. All right, so let's move into kind of the core principles of GCP. So I hope everyone's got a good understanding of all the acronyms. Most of the rest of the time I'm going to spend on GCP. So I'm actually going to start with the R2 core principles, though they have somehow changed in R3. I'll show you how. So you get a whole idea of the spectrum of the principles that come under GCP. So of course, the first one is ethics, that with clinical trials should be done ethically. This is the overarching principle. including what's there in the GCP, other applicable regulatory requirements, the Declaration of Helsinki in terms of human subject protection. So this is the responsibility of everyone. All of us have to be making sure that we are abiding by this principle. The second principle is trial risk versus trial benefit. So before you start a trial, you should be looking at what could be the risk associated with it, and then weigh it against the benefit. And only if the benefits justify the risks should the trial be conducted. So this is primarily a responsibility of the sponsor of the study, but even to some extent the IRB. The IRB also makes a judgment to this regard as to whether the trial should be conducted or not, especially for investigator-initiated studies. Another consideration, this is again kind of ethical, the most important consideration is actually the participants. So whenever you see the term subjects, that's from R2, they also have changed to participants. So the right, safety, and well-being of the trial participants is the most important, and that goes above the interests of science and society. And again, the sponsor, the IRB, and I think the research team are responsible for applying this principle. Before we put something in humans, we should have enough information from non-clinical and other clinical information. It should be adequate to support the clinical trial. So jumping from an idea to a clinical trial may not be the right thing to do. Unless you're repurposing a drug, it may be a different situation. Again, the sponsor and IRB look at that. Good quality trial, principle 5, the clinical trial should have a clear and detailed protocol. This is again the sponsor, and then the IRB reviews that. There could be scientific reviews that could look at that. But again, this is another core principle. Then this starts becoming more relevant to us, that we should be conducting the trial in compliance with the protocol. That has been approved. We know it's an approved protocol. We should be conducting the trial in compliance. That's a responsibility of the investigator, the research team, but also the clinical research organizations that oversee the research, the IRB, who we report any adverse events, etc., and also any deviations from the protocol. Medical decisions. The medical care should continue, and medical decisions should always be the responsibility of somebody who's qualified to do it. So you can't hand over just because a person's in a trial, you don't become responsible for the entire care, but you have to make sure that they are getting the appropriate medical care by the qualified folks. So that falls on the investigator and the research team. The trial staff, another principle is that all the staff on a trial should be qualified by education, by training and experience to perform the tasks that they're designated. And again, this is the responsibility of the investigator, the research team, the clinical research organizations that oversee the conduct of these trials. Informed consent, a very basic principle, should be obtained from every subject before every participant, but before clinical trial participation. That's for us to ensure that we do that in each participant. Clinical trial data, all data should be recorded, handled, and stored in a way to allow accurate reporting, interpretation, and verification. Again, a lot of that falls on investigators and research teams. Confidentiality is very important. The confidentiality of our participants should be protected, and again, following the requirements which apply to that. And again, that befalls on us mainly. This is more of depending on where the studied drug is being manufactured, but the investigational products should be manufactured under what they call good manufacturing practice, or CGMP, current good manufacturing practice, and then they should be used in accordance with the protocol. Again, this is mostly a sponsor's responsibility, but the handling and storage is many a time falls on the investigator and the team. So we have to be follow this principle too. And then, there should be quality assurance. This was kind of, you can see it's a principle 13, but if you look at the new version, quality by design, they moved it up into the whole design aspect. Otherwise, here the quality in the previous version was more of an afterthought. Yeah, we should be making sure everything is of quality, and everybody should be responsible for that. So those are the 13 core principles. And how have they changed? So they have been changed in the revision 3. So what they did was it took 5 of those. Now they're 11 rather than 13. And they took 5 of those and put that into one big ethical principle that we should follow the ethics. That's informed consent. I mean, we can go back, but you can see those are all relating to the ethics of doing the study properly. Informed consent is still there. The fact that the IRB review needs to happen is still there. The scientific value of the study is still there. Qualified individuals should do the work. Quality is quite important. But there are 2 new ones, the numbers 7 and 10. So, but I'll come that to them in the end. Number 8, protocol. There should be a well-defined protocol is still there. The results should be reliable and the product should be handled in an appropriate manner. Those are still there, numbered somewhat differently. The 2 new ones they introduced in this new revision principles are risk proportionality and roles and responsibilities. So let's delve a bit into that. So in terms of proportionality and risk, clinical trials, processes, measures, and approaches should be implemented in a way that's proportionate to the risks to the participants and to the importance of the data collected, and I love that line, avoid unnecessary burden on participants and investigators. We're all too aware of, clinical trial burden, and I don't know how much this has been taken to heart at this point by many of our sponsors. But if you're designing a trial and if they are designing a trial, they should be keeping that in mind. Again, as an example, if I gave you, if you have a relatively, an intervention which, maybe is a minor change from a previous drug or is just involves and doesn't involve much risk, do we have to have all the complexity that goes along with something which has the potential of more risk? So that's the concept of risk proportionality and adjusting the rigor, or not so much the rigor, but the burden of the clinical trial accordingly. The other new principle is roles and responsibilities. And it was mentioned before in the previous, but now they've made it as a separate principle that the roles and responsibilities should be very clear and documented. So while the new principle, the previous one is more an issue from the sponsor point of view, but I think this affects how we do things, that we need to be even more explicit about the roles and responsibilities that befall on us and who we delegate to as investigators. So this is a new principle that's quite important. So here's a kind of a summary of the revised principles. Ethical principles are all the ethical aspects that I'm sure you're all well aware of. Informed consent, IRB review, science. They kind of stressed both for IRB and for science that this should not be just fixed at one point. This should be to some extent a continuing process where we should be aware of, are there any changes in the science? Are there other studies that have found things that need us to modify the protocol? Similarly, with IRB review, are there changes in the regulatory requirements that need us to look at the study in a different way? Qualified individuals, quality, again, should be good, but it should be by design. It should be something that we factor in from the very beginning. A well-designed protocol, which is clearly written, reliable results, again, there's a bit more emphasis on that and more wording on that, and I'll talk a bit about that. And of course, investigational products should be handled and designed properly. Any questions from anyone? Elizabeth? Catherine, any questions, or are we good?
There are no questions in the chat at this time, but please, hold on, I think we do have one. Okay. There are some roles, like clinical pharmacology and pharmacometrics, that overlap with others and ideally should be collaborative. Example, with biostatistics and translational science research. The territory disputes between pharmacometrics and statistics are legendary. So I think that's just a comment. Do you have anything to say?
Interesting. Yeah. I think this seems like more of a personal experience. If somebody wants to expand on that, we talked about it. I mean, from the GCP point of view, it's that it should be well defined. who's
Yeah,
doing the biostatistics, who's doing the
Sanjay, if I could
pharmacometrics?
say more definitely, I've had this
Uh-huh.
situation in practically every organization I've worked for the last 23 years, that the roles and responsibilities are not clear, that when there is an overlap, results in territory disputes, which actually are quite deleterious to the conduct of the trial and sometimes to the health of the patients. To put it very bluntly, especially regarding pharmacometrics and statistics, the statistician typically cannot tolerate the pharmacometrician questioning the validity of their statistical results, and the value of the clinical pharmacology input is and its impact on the design of the trial is often lost. These things can be as simple as the statistician unable to understand the dosing of the drug, or utterly dramatic, as I saw with one sponsor who tried to dose neonates at a dose that had already killed animals. So these things are not trivial. They're not spelled out anywhere, and so the roles and responsibilities, attempts to fully segregate them, result unfortunately in silos, with organizational departments not sharing data with each other, and spending time in territory disputes rather than collaborating. So that is a comment, but it's a serious problem, and it impacts the value of contributed to by modeling and simulation to the trials, and it impacts the conduct of the trials and indirectly the public health.
That's a point well taken. I think that's obviously you've dealt with this, and I mean that could be a translational science question as to how to improve that. I think that way, the couple of concepts I really liked in the R3. One was, of course, better role and responsibility delegation, very clear cut. They really emphasize that. Second thing they do emphasize also is, as I said, quality by design. That in the design phase we need to be more thoughtful, more, and I think part of this could be design aspects of things. That the different teams are working together, and it's clear who's doing what, and they listen to each other. And then also they also bring up a point of what they call critical to quality. So really focusing on aspects of the trial that are really going to impact the quality. Like, as you mentioned, the dosing aspect of it, that's critical, right? I mean, that's absolutely critical. So really focusing that, I think the concept comes up later. So I think they're trying to address that, but I hear you, and clearly this is actually a very good translational science question we should talk about and see if there are better ways to do that. Yeah. Well, thank you for your input. That's really insightful. Okay, let's move on. All right, so let's do a couple of exercises. I know you just name the principle, of course. I don't expect you to remember the number. So a company discovers that a new statin that reduces cholesterol by about the same amount as currently available agents, but preclinical and early phase clinical data indicate it has twice the rate of liver toxicity. So anyone want to kind of speak up or put in the chat what principle is being violated here?
Oh, we have one, risk-benefit ratio.
Absolutely. That's absolutely correct. So trial risk versus trial benefit. I mean, clearly in this case, the risk is not worth the potential benefit because you're not really moving the needle when it comes to benefit, and you're increasing the risk. So this study should not be even be done. Let's take another example. A scientist discovers a new chemical entity that reduces cholesterol by 10 times the amount as currently available agents, and then proceeds to do a clinical trial with it. Any comment as to what principle is being violated? So, okay, I mean, essentially that's, we should have all the information, all the preclinical and other clinical information should justify the use of that particular product in humans. We really need that. There is an interesting development. I don't know if you're following the news where they're saying, oh, maybe we don't need all of these animal studies and we can move to more of in silico working out whether they have, whether it's going to be tolerated. I'm not sure where that is going to go, but as things stand today, yes, you really do need to be very careful about putting anything into humans that doesn't have adequate preclinical and clinical data. So that's the principle that's being violated. Oops. Sorry, this answer came. Okay. All right. So this one, this is an example of where the protocol is unclear. So there's a protocol that has two different doses in different parts of the protocol. So, the protocols need to be internally consistent, and you can't have different information or different ideas within one protocol. So that's another really important principle of good clinical practice. Okay. Oh, sorry, I don't know how that happened. Okay, well, here's another one. And this comes up, if you have a participant who only understands a certain language and the only consent you have is in English and they only understand Spanish, then basically that's not informed consent. So that person is not capable of understanding all the various aspects of the risks and benefits of the potential study. So that would be another violation of the informed consent principles. And this is for you guys to give me other instances of other GCP principles being violated. Anyone want to talk about it? We already heard from Emmanuel about, where the conflicts in terms of who's doing what can be a problem. Any other ideas or thoughts?
And look, Brian has a question that I think he needs to clarify. He says, can you break them into phases?
Yeah, I was referring back to the perhaps unclear protocol. Can you separate them into different phases? That way it's
Yeah.
more clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh.
I think what I think I was referring to was inconsistency in a protocol. But absolutely, you can have different doses and different phases, and there's a lot of interest in, for example, Brian, in these adaptive trials now. And there is clearly a big place for innovative trial designs, and including phases, including Bayesian kind of designs where you, especially in oncology trials, where if your results are heading in the right direction, you put more patients in the active arm, so you're not spending a lot of patients on placebo. So things like those are in the works and definitely should be considered. I think I hope that in a few years we will look back and say our standard randomized double-blind 1-to-1 placebo-controlled trial design was not the best way to do things, and there are better ways to do things. So I hope that happens.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts about other GCP?
There is another question or comment. Investigators should explicitly state to participants that the participation is voluntary because that's not always done.
Oh, absolutely essential. Yeah, that is absolutely essential. That should never slip through an IRB. That should be, I think, one of the fundamental principles of informed consent. Yeah. Yeah, I think to me right now personally, I think that people are still putting all the trials at the same level of risk. So I'm hoping that I'm right now it's being violated because all this is so new, that I would like to see trials where the proportionality element comes in, and also in terms of burden, I think clinical trials are actually becoming more burdensome in some ways. And hopefully again, the GCP, the new rules clearly state that we should be trying to decrease burden. So to me, those fundamental changes need to happen in how we approach trials. All right, so let's kind of go over what needs to be done to kind of move to become consistent with the new GCP version. So we need to kind of, as I mentioned, do critical to quality thinking. So we've talked about quality by design and the proportionality elements. So all of these things need to start coming into the elements of design. Again, mostly sponsors, but hey, if you folks are writing trials, these are the kind of things you need to think about. Decentralization and digital health technologies, the good old risk-based management plans, how we used to handle that data and the quality of the data, all of that has to be rethought for these digital health technologies. A lot of vendors are involved now because of the complexity of trials, especially bringing in all these remote monitoring and all. So those vendors actually have to follow GCP, and but that oversight lies with the sponsor, so they need to be up to date with it. People need to be trained on all these new rules. Um, and the one I've highlighted in yellow is the one that's actually applicable. The rest of it is more applicable to our sponsors, but the last part is a strong is a expectation that the documentation will meet these expanded principles. I'll come to it. And so I think that's something we need to be careful about in terms of a documentation.
We do have a
So,
question, if you don't
sure.
mind. When you say proportion-based risk, is it at the participant level or the entire study sample level?
I think it's in the design of the study level. So I'll give you an example. There was a study in mild asthma, I think published in the New England, which was entirely remote, entirely. So everything was done without the patients even coming in, and highly efficient way of doing it. Was it appropriate for mild asthma? Of course. These are people with the mildest, the mild, intermittent, occasional shortness of breath and wheezing, and they were given this inhaler to use versus another one to use at the time when they had these episodes. And it was a positive study showing one was better than the other, and they didn't have multiple visits. And if you normally do an asthma study, you're doing multiple breathing tests, coming patients coming in, you're teaching them this inhalers multiple times. All of that was not done. So that was to me a good example of how to improve the efficiency of a study, because the risk of that inhaler was very little, compared to the standard treatment. So I hope that kind of explains the concept. Okay. Great questions, Emily. Keep that up. Great discussion. So this is more of a explanation of, these new concepts. Again, I don't fully understand them, but I thought I'll bring this in, and I'm sure you can look at the slides later. But what they're saying is, determine what are the critical aspects of a protocol that really matter. Does it matter if, again, going back to asthma, does it really even matter that they have to do the breathing test 6 times? Is it critical to the quality of the study, or is it more critical to see how many times they end up in the hospital or the emergency room? So, addressing identifying the critical needs and identifying, paying attention to those factors when you design studies is important. The other thing they actually suggested was, get stakeholders. This is a concept that the CTSI has been promoting: is get the stakeholders involved, get the participants, potential patients and participants involved, get healthcare professionals involved in your design of the study. The data acquisition tools should be fit for the purpose. And again, they stress not to have excessive burden on participants and investigators. Okay. There is other things which are there in the R3. I don't have really time to spend on them, but I will actually spend on a couple of them. There is, clearly an openness for decentralized trials, remote trials, digital health technologies, looking even at real world data. So there are these innovative designs of kind of taking real world data and then kind of designing using, again, this is beyond above my level of how you can use statistical and modeling methods to kind of have a control group within the real world data. So there's a lot of they are open to that now. They do have stronger expectations of sponsor oversight of vendors and service providers, because there's so many of them involved in studies now. And there's a lot of emphasis on data governance, especially. So the whole data flow. So I think they have a figure for that here. Here it is. So they are stressing now that, data should be from this whole full data life cycle, from all the way from capturing the data to destruction of the data, including all of this should be well spelled out, should be all the people responsible should be identified, etc. So that's another very interesting emphasis. Investigator, this is within the R3 again. Ideas, again, I've kind of said all this, but they kind of have stressed some important aspects to it. That qualification and training is very important. Resources should be sufficient to do the trials. They kind of stress that in this current version. The delegation of activity should be very clear, and except when it's going to be purely clinical care. So these are again concepts you can go through. The last part I'm just going to address in very general ways. I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with how do we do good clinical practice? What does it mean in everyday practice? So let's get into this, just practical aspects. So from the practical aspects, as from the investigator research team point of view, I think the most important thing is ensure that you have a proper informed consent, following the protocol, controlling the investigational product in terms of accountability and dispensation, and documentation. Those are I think, the most kind of central principles to our responsibilities as investigators or research team. When you look at FDAs, when they come in and find problems, what do they find? They follow that, either the protocol was not followed, record keeping was inadequate, IP was not accounted for, the IRB was not told when things went wrong or things went differently than expected, and failure to report adverse events and unanticipated events. So in simple words, stay with the protocol, do not deviate from it, except when it's necessary for the participants' health, immediate health, not just a remote consequence. And of course, any protocol deviations need to be documented and reported. Now, some of the protocol, there are lots of reasons protocol deviations happen. Of course, first of all, the protocol could be written poorly and the design poorly. So that can sometimes be the problem. But other times it could be that you don't know the regulations or the protocol itself. The feasibility assessment was inadequate oversight, inadequate resources. If for example, research coordinators running from one patient participant to another, they're not really paying attention to all the details. And finally, I think having adequate delegation of tasks and duties, so people who are not qualified do not end up doing things which they're not supposed to. The other emphasis, which is not new, but is source documentation. That's another way to stay within GCP. So basically, source documents are the source data that, all the clinical findings, observations, other activities in a clinical trial, they all go into source documents. So basically, you can reconstruct and evaluate the trial later if you want to. So these are all the source documents. I won't go through the list, but anything that pertains to the study goes into can be thought about as source documents. So keeping on top of maintaining those is essential. And as I said, the reason for this is it's a pain, but the reason for this is so that they can basically go back and say if things go wrong, they can do that, or if they want to look at more information, all the information that they need is there in one source, and they can look at that and be able to reconstruct what happened. So I think that's really important. That's why source documents are important. Things that we should be documenting otherwise, making sure that we looked at the eligibility criteria, any adverse events, lab and other protocols, accountability of participants, where they are, how they're doing, progress notes, the case report forms should be complete. And again, these are the common documentation problems that happen. Nothing surprising here. Missing data, dates, attribution, like who did the exam on this patient. Identifiers are not there. Scribbling out or whiting out illegible documentation, and not having proper notes as source documents. Now, the standards for documentation actually have expanded, and that is where I think we need to kind of be aware of. And I'm sure our sponsors are going to tell us, but I think we need to have that awareness. So the previous standard used to be ALCOA, was the acronym, with A being attributable, that you can tell who did this documentation. legible, that's the L. Contemporaneous, which means that you're not putting in data much later than when it was originated. Original, that means you're not just copying and pasting stuff a lot. And accurate, that it really reflects the reality of the patient. But now it's been expanded. So now this is becoming the standard. It's known as Alcoa Plus, and then it became Alcoa Plus Plus. So to the Alcoa that I showed you on the left, now they've added, the first they had added these 4 elements, that it should be complete, and the don't delete or do things, this is again at the level more of data analysis, consistent, that everything is consistent among the records, and for example, having proper timestamps, etc. Enduring, essentially all of these, you can see there's some funny comments over there, but everything should be recorded in proper media. That'll be there and they can be revisited, available at any time in terms for reviewing, for auditing, for inspection, and then they added traceable. So throughout the process, the data should be traceable as to when it was collected, where it went, where it was stored, and how it was handled. So this is now the Alcoa Plus Plus criteria. So our obligations to this have expanded, and we need to be keeping up with this. Just one thing about like records needing correction that happens all the time. Do not obliterate it, so no scribbling or whiteouts. Date the change, identify who's doing it, why we are doing it, and make sure that what you're doing is the correct change. And just the final words on documentation. So what we really want the documentation to be good enough that anyone who comes in from the outside, for example, an auditor or the clinical CRO, research organization, that they can reconstruct what happened, who did what and when. It was accurate, it's authentic, everything is organized and complete. So that's the kind of the documentation expectations we have today. So that's all I had. I mean, there's of course plenty more. We could talk for another hour with, about GCP. It's such a big thing, but I hope I try to kind of summarize the changes. I'm kind of excited about, and I'm hoping sponsors will move in this direction. But also, as we, would like to highly encourage people to have, if you have ideas, to write for clinical research protocols or clinical trial protocols, and essentially the CTSI can help with some of that. But even we have now the flexibility to incorporate all these elements into the clinical trial design. Further questions in terms of research compliance, of course, Rich Corrales is our compliance officer. And then the clinical research office that I run is also available for us to help you answer questions and deal with issues that came up while you do your clinical trials and clinical research. And
Excellent.
here are the
Thank you.
objectives again. And I just wanted to make sure that we met the objectives, that you know what these acronyms stand for, and at least some of the essential components. I couldn't cover everything, but at least some of the essential components. And I'll be glad to take any questions or comments.